Good evening and welcome to Global News Watch. We are tracking a rapidly escalating international crisis tonight that threatens to destabilize global maritime trade and dramatically redefine the rules of engagement on the high seas. Tensions between the United States and Venezuela have reached a critical new inflection point, following the dramatic and highly controversial seizure of a Venezuelan-flagged oil tanker. This action, executed with precision by U.S. forces, has elicited a furious and immediate reaction from Caracas. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro has unleashed a fiery condemnation of the U.S. action, labeling the move in the most unambiguous terms as nothing less than an act of naval piracy. He warns that this not only violates international law, but critically escalates already fraught relations between Washington and Caracas to perilous, perhaps irreparable levels. This is fundamentally more than just a routine legal dispute or a sanctions enforcement measure. It is a high-stakes geopolitical standoff involving the fundamental questions of global oil supply integrity, the extraterritorial reach of unilateral international sanctions, and the desperate, prolonged struggle for political legitimacy in Venezuela. We will break down the precise operational details of the seizure, provide the essential background context that led us to this dangerous moment, and analyze exactly what this means for the global maritime industry and the precarious political balance across the South American continent. Let's get straight to the facts of this urgent developing story. The incident centers specifically on the supertanker the Neptune's Shadow, a very large crude carrier flying the Venezuelan flag. This massive vessel was carrying a substantial, high-value cargo, reported by industry analysts to be approximately 2 million barrels of crude oil, with an estimated market value in the hundreds of millions of dollars. The shipment was reportedly destined for a major refinery in a specific Asian nation, a country importantly not subject to existing U.S. sanctions, highlighting Venezuela's persistent attempts to find legal pathways around the punitive American restrictions. The dramatic seizure was carried out in the pre-dawn hours by U.S. authorities, specifically highly trained elements of the U.S. Coast Guard, augmented by logistical support from the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet. This joint operation was executed under the authority of a seizure and forfeiture warrant issued by a U.S. federal court in the Southern District of Texas. U.S. officials assert emphatically that the seizure is entirely legitimate and legally sound. They cite violations of existing comprehensive U.S. sanctions. Sanctions specifically designed to isolate the controversial Maduro regime and systematically cut off its primary life-sustaining source of foreign revenue, oil exports. Washington argues that because the revenue generated from the sale of this crude oil would directly fund illicit activities and the continued corruption of the Maduro regime, the cargo and the vessel itself are subject to forfeiture under U.S. law. Caracas, however, paints a vastly and fundamentally different picture. President Maduro, speaking earlier today in a nationally televised address from Miraflores Palace, was unequivocal in his outrage, his tone defiant and bellicose. He accused the United States of flagrantly violating international maritime law, infringing upon Venezuelan sovereignty, and attempting to overtly sabotage Venezuela's legitimate commercial trade activities with willing partners. This action is being framed by Caracas and its allies, most notably Cuba, Russia, and Iran, as nothing less than an economic blockade disguised thinly as a legal enforcement operation. The U.S. State Department and the Treasury Department have so far declined to offer specific, granular comments on the operational tactics or the precise location of the interception, simply reiterating Washington's firm, unshakable commitment to rigorously enforcing sanctions against any and all forms of illicit trade supporting the Maduro government. The Department of Justice released a brief statement confirming the seizure related to a complex scheme to evade sanctions and funnel funds for corruption, but offered no further immediate details. The silence from Washington on the specifics, contrasted with the blistering condemnation from Caracas, only serves to underscore the extreme sensitivity of this incident. To truly understand the political and economic gravity of this seizure, we must look beyond the immediate headlines and examine the deeply entrenched, nearly decade-long conflict between Washington and Caracas. The United States, along with the majority of European Union nations, Canada, and nearly 60 other countries, does not currently recognize Nicolas Maduro as the democratically legitimate president of Venezuela. Instead, Washington continues to officially recognize and back opposition leader Juan Guaidó, who claims constitutional authority as interim president. This profound political rift, this battle for the soul of the Venezuelan nation, has been the engine driving a punishing, comprehensive sanctions regime targeting Venezuelan oil production, state finance sectors, and the highly lucrative gold trade since 2019. These sanctions, which operate essentially as an economic chokehold, have severely crippled Venezuela's capacity to export its vast subterranean oil reserves that are among the largest in the world. The resulting lack of revenue has contributed directly to a profound, ongoing humanitarian and economic crisis that has seen millions flee the country. However, the Maduro regime, known for its resilience and international maneuvering, has continually sought out creative methods and non-traditional partners, often in Asia or the Middle East, to circumvent these crippling restrictions. This often involves highly complex maritime routes, sophisticated ship-to-ship transfers conducted in remote areas to obscure the oil's true origin, and the use of ghost ships that turn off their location transponders. The dramatic seizure of the Neptune Shadow signals a monumental and deeply significant escalation in Washington's enforcement strategy. It moves decisively beyond previous measures, which focused largely on financial penalties, asset freezes, and targeting individual transactions. This move is a direct physical interdiction of a sovereign-flagged Venezuelan asset on the high seas, a bold operational challenge to the regime's revenue lifeline. For Venezuela, losing a shipment of this sheer size is a major, agonizing financial blow, disrupting critical cash flow and undermining trade relationships that Caracas has painstakingly built to bypass sanctions. But the political damage, arguably, is even greater. This incident provides Maduro with a powerful nationalistic rallying point. He can pivot the domestic narrative away from the abysmal failures and corruption of his own socialist regime and toward a narrative of external aggression, effectively portraying the U.S. as an imperial aggressor attempting to starve the Venezuelan people. This seizure effectively raises the stakes of the ongoing geopolitical chess match dramatically, putting naval forces potentially in direct proximity. What are the legal ramifications of such an audacious move, and what is the international precedent being set here? Joining us now via satellite for a deeper, critical look at the legal and diplomatic implications is Dr. Lena Harris. Dr. Harris is a recognized expert in international maritime law and geopolitics from the prestigious Institute for Policy Studies, and she focuses heavily on the interpretation of sanctions regimes. Dr. Harris, thank you for being with us during this crucial time. Let's address the legal heart of this controversy first. From a legal standpoint, Maduro's government is calling this piracy, a crime punishable under international law. Does the U.S. truly have a solid, legally defensible footing for seizing a tanker flying a foreign flag, potentially in international waters, merely on the basis of sanctions violation? That indeed, Mr. Anchor, is the central and most contentious question, and as is often the case in high-stakes international law, the answer is complex and shaded in ambiguity. U.S. authorities are not claiming to be enforcing international maritime law regarding piracy, which typically involves non-state actors for private gain. Instead, they are very likely leveraging broad, powerful domestic statutes, specifically counterterrorism, narcotics trafficking, and sanctions evasion forfeiture statutes. They will argue that the vessel and its cargo constitute proceeds or assets intended for use in sanction violations, making them subject to forfeiture proceedings in a U.S. federal court. However, the key jurisdictional challenge, as Caracas correctly points out, revolves around the high seas. When you conduct an armed seizure of a vessel on the high seas, meaning outside any nation's exclusive economic zone or territorial waters, you are entering into highly sensitive legal territory. Caracas will argue vehemently that the U.S. federal court lacks any legitimate jurisdiction over a Venezuelan state-owned vessel and its cargo, simply transiting international waters between two non-sanctioned ports. This will not be a quick, tidy resolution. This is destined to become a protracted, landmark legal battle that will thoroughly test and potentially redefine the extraterritorial limits of U.S. sanctions enforcement globally, setting a precedent that other nations, including China and Russia, are watching very closely. The diplomatic dimension is perhaps even more pressing than the legal one. What does this aggressive, highly visible move achieve in the halls of diplomacy? Does it genuinely pressure Maduro to change course, or does it simply harden his political position and give him a new weapon for propaganda? That's the strategic paradox of this maneuver. In the short term, it achieves a clear, tangible financial victory for the U.S. by disrupting a major revenue stream. The immediate impact is pain for the regime. However, the strategic and long-term political outcome is decidedly mixed. It unequivocally hardens Maduro's stance. He thrives on conflict and external threats. He can now immediately pivot the entire domestic and international narrative away from the crushing poverty, the widespread corruption, and the democratic deficit of his regime, and instead focus entirely on what he will successfully portray as illegal, aggressive, and hostile U.S. interference. For a dictator struggling with domestic credibility, this is a gift. Furthermore, this type of forceful interdiction risks seriously alienating third parties, even those nations who may publicly or privately dislike the Maduro regime. Why? Because these nations, particularly those heavily reliant on global shipping, fear the precedent. They worry about the terrifying prospect of major global powers feeling empowered to seize commercial tankers at will based on their own unilateral interpretations of domestic law, potentially destabilizing the very core principles of global shipping security and the freedom of the seas. It's a very high-risk move designed to maximize immediate economic pressure, but it virtually guarantees an adversarial, entrenched reaction and deep international skepticism regarding the rule of law. Dr. Lena Harris, thank you for sharing your insightful analysis on this complex and concerning incident. The situation remains exceptionally fluid. The geopolitical fallout has only just begun. Legal challenges from Venezuela are expected imminently, likely filed in several international jurisdictions, including potentially the International Court of Justice, aiming to reclaim the massive vessel and its highly valuable cargo. Behind the scenes, diplomatic channels are reportedly operating in overdrive, both officially and unofficially, attempting to manage the fallout to prevent any further potential military or aggressive maneuvers in the Caribbean or off the Venezuelan coast. What is absolutely clear tonight is that this dramatic physical seizure of the Neptune's shadow marks a deeply dangerous, tangible turning point in the years-long US-Venezuela standoff. It solidifies an era of aggressive, kinetic enforcement that carries significant and undeniable risks, not only for the stability of international commerce and the security of global shipping routes, but for the regional political stability of Latin America. The world is watching to see how Maduro retaliates and whether Washington can successfully defend its audacious enforcement action in the unforgiving court of international law. We will continue to monitor the immediate aftermath of this incident and bring you reaction from the international community, oil market analysts, and crucially, the latest maneuvers from both Washington and Caracas. For comprehensive, real-time updates on this developing story, including the latest court filings, diplomatic responses, and expert briefings, please visit our website, globalnewswatch.com, and subscribe to our real-time alerts. That's all for tonight. Thank you for making Global News Watch your trusted source for in-depth, authoritative reporting. Good night.